The Doctor, Season 13, written by Alexander Leiths, edited by Ella Dumitru, the ongoing parody of a once-beloved TV show. Chapter 1. Far, Far Away. A few flakes of snow danced playfully over the Antarctic tundra, lifted and spun by a relatively gentle midsummer breeze. By now the snow was all too familiar with the tall blue box standing upon the plain, and was utterly unfazed by it. Around the TARDIS, standing or lying, were countless penguins, well spaced from each other at perhaps 10 meters or more, but spreading in countless numbers almost to the horizon. Many of these avian residents shuffled around in a confused fashion, as if recently awakened from a long sleep, or possibly a nightmare. Many more lay unmoving upon the snow, cold and dead. Almost at the horizon itself, it looked as if a vast, dark, shallow wave were standing like some oily tsunami threatening to sweep across the land, to drown all in a viscous slick of purest night. Only this tsunami was receding. The TARDIS doors were open a crack, and a cable played out through this narrow opening. The cable, in turn, fed into K9 via the inspection hatch in his right side. K9 still wore the crown-like FDSS fragment on his head, but this had been joined by yet another accoutrement. His nose laser was extended, and from this coiled another wire, narrower than the one from the TARDIS. This lead spiraled upwards until it connected with the base of the sonic screwdriver, clutched in the Doctor's outstretched hand. The Doctor stood with his other hand upon the waist of his snazzy black suit, staring determinedly out towards that ominous horizon, presumably watching the retreating wave. He was dressed only in the aforementioned suit, plus cream shirt and Doc Marten boots, no extra layer required in spite of the extreme, by human standards, cold. The one unusual addition to his outfit he had made was a pair of ear defenders. A matching pair also adorned the head of the woman next to him. She wore only black leather biker gear with no extra Antarctic-appropriate attire, similarly impervious, it seemed, to the icy fingers of the soft but freezing breeze. Romana's right hand rested on the top of a solid-looking metal walking cane, its tip buried in the snow. This second Time Lord also gave close attention to the black mass dwindling in the distance, occasionally glancing sideways at the Doctor. Slowly, the black wall shrank and disappeared. Romana tapped the Doctor's arm, and his eyes flicked in her direction. "I think it is gone," Romana shouted, heavily exaggerating the mouthing of her words. The Doctor tapped a switch on the screwdriver and slipped off his ear defenders. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I couldn't hear a word," he responded. Romana rolled her eyes a little, then removed her own protection. "I said," she explained with labored patience, "I think it's gone." As she repeated her assessment, she nodded towards the horizon. The Doctor chuckled. "You know, I think you may be right," he replied with a tiny smile of satisfaction. His humor might have also been tinged by a little amusement at his companion's obvious slight irritation. By now, those penguins still infested with the bulk entities will be so far apart that their infections will almost certainly seep out of our reality back into the bulk and leave them free of their influence. Romana waved one arm, gesturing at the surrounding penguins still in various states of mobility. "Free or dead, it seems." The Doctor harumphed a little at this. "Yes, well, obviously there have been some casualties, but their surviving numbers are sufficient to recover in a decade or two. And besides, there was always going to be some cost after such prolonged contact with the bulk. You of all people should know that." Romana raised an eyebrow. "Should I? Are you sure you're not thinking of someone else?" Although her tone held a note of mocking reproval, she had not been entirely able to hide her smile, betraying her tease. The Doctor looked momentarily flustered. No, I don't mean like that. Not direct experience. I just mean you know all the details of our most recent adventures, being so intimately involved and so instrumental in their successful conclusion." Romana nodded sagely. "Ah, of course. I quite understand." Then she was struck by the doctor's final words. "So it is concluded, then? Our mopping up of the lingering effects of the bulk incursions?" The doctor gave a single snort through his nose. "Hardly. I mean, there are probably many incursions we missed or simply never encountered, just within that sector of the universe which formed the fragment we were in. As to the rest, we never even scanned those prior to the universe fusing again. That would have been impossible at that time. No, I'm sure there is much damage still to be uncovered, out there in time and space." Romana looked downcast and not a little weary. "But," the doctor continued in perkier tones, "I think our responsibilities are more than met in this regard. We have checked all our known issues, the attic in Ealing, Mondus and its ministers. Chebua seems to be coping with a Levithia unbound, or more precisely, the Gramrak's reunification with its planet. Radreg has reversed the flight of the Alshine, and all is returning to normal on Aquathi. We fumigated the cathedral of New Savannah, did what we could to stabilize the situation in Weymouth. Unfortunately, there was little we could do about the ruins of the Nosna civilization, while End of the Line is now more normally connected with the rest of the universe. The corpses litter but no longer roam its ruddy plains and hills." At the mention of this final obscure planet, Romana's grip upon her cane tightened a little, and she glanced sorrowfully down at it. Whether the doctor noticed this or not was unclear. His tone was just as upbeat as before when he continued, "Yes, I think we can safely say we have met our responsibilities and more." Romana shook off whatever dark ghosts remained with a toss of her hair. When next she spoke, her tone almost matched the doctor's in positivity. "Right then. So where now, Doctor?" The doctor detached the cable from the base of his sonic screwdriver, letting the wire fall to the snow while pocketing his trusty device. He then stuffed his hands into his pockets, breathed deeply of the Antarctic air, and looked around them, beaming a satisfied smile over the wintry wasteland. "We could just watch the sunset?" he suggested amiably, nodding towards the Earth's star a mere 20 degrees above the horizon. Romana huffed impatiently and put her hands on her hips. "Doctor, stop playing for time!" The doctor gave a wry smile. "I take your point," he conceded ruefully. "How about Paris?" he suggested suddenly. "I hear that in this time period they have Christmas markets to rival those of Munich or Cologne." Romana pursed her lips and frowned at the doctor. "It's January." "Well, we do have a time machine," the doctor offered helpfully. Romana threw her hands in the air in exasperation. "Doctor, we are always on Earth. We spend far too much time here. As you yourself said, we do have a time machine. We can go anywhere in time and space." Now it was the doctor's turn to frown. "We don't spend all our time on Earth. Why, in our most recent adventures we explored Mondas, Zardil, Janus, Levithia, Aquathi, New Savannah, Nielnir, and End of the Line." Romana shook her head. "A very selective account of our most recent travels. We also explored Antarctica, Foxgrove, Ealing, the South Pole again, more or less, Ealing again, Weymouth, and finally the Trap Street in central London. And then we had to visit them all again in the cleanup, which is why we are standing, once again, in Antarctica. I would like to get as far away from Earth as possible, both in space and time." The doctor rubbed his chin thoughtfully as he considered her words. "As far away as possible, eh?" the doctor mused to himself. Then he looked up into Romana's eyes and smiled, clearly in possession of a solution. "I think I have just the place," he began, nodding. 200,000 years in the future and thousands of light years away around a blue B-type star." He nodded once again towards the sun. "Believe me, you'll see everything in an entirely new light." Romana pursed her lips at his play on words, but could not entirely suppress her smile. "That does sound like a welcome change. Does this place have a name by any chance?" "Of course," the doctor cried. "The planet I was thinking of is called Albia. The inhabitants are non-human. In fact, the system is far, far away from any areas of human expansion in that part of the galaxy. It is highly unlikely we'll find any Earthlings there at this point in their history, or any other for that matter. They are technologically capable in the period I am thinking of, but well below Gallifreyan. As such, They should provide an interesting source of study and research, as well as providing a lovely change of scene from dear old planet Earth. Romana smiled freely now, nodding in satisfaction. "Then let's waste no more time here, Doctor," she said, gesturing to the snowy landscape before them, before pointing determinedly at the TARDIS doors. "Time to explore brave new worlds." At that the Doctor nodded, and together he, Romana and K9 entered the familiar blue box. The TARDIS pirouetted and spun, flying a couple of 100 meters above the streets of an enormous city. The doors from the main console room were wide open, an ever-changing view of the city scanning haphazardly across this exposed patch. From this relatively low and rapidly dropping vantage point, the city filled the landscape to the horizon. Not that it was easy to make out details as the image swam and tossed sickeningly in the opening. "Doctor," Romana began disapprovingly as she reached towards the door controls, "have you forgotten how to drive?" With that she flicked a switch and the doors swung smoothly closed. The Doctor watched this with a grin as he clutched the sides of the console for support. The grin only partially covered his expression of effort, possibly even struggle, as he wrestled with the TARDIS controls. "Nonsense," he retorted with impatient bravado. "I used to do this sort of thing all the time, and in my current regeneration to boot. Well, or my previous identical one. Oh, you know what I mean." Romana looked extremely doubtful. "I hate to raise the issue of luck when flying, but aren't you technically the 13th of your line?" The Doctor shook his head dismissively. "Pah! I've burnt a regeneration before and kept the face, and I didn't up my personal count then. Why should I start now?" Romana still looked far from convinced. "I believe on that earlier occasion you were entirely in control of the process, which I suppose might make a difference to your counting. But as I understand it, your latest regeneration was anything but standard, or in any way under your control, unless you count the intervention of your first self." The Doctor's frown deepened still further upon hearing mention of the first. "Well, unless you really want to go around calling me Lucky 13, perhaps for appearance sake, if you'll pardon the pun, we should just go on calling me 12. Not that we ever do anyway." By now the TARDIS was a mere 50 feet above the rooftops, and clearly would not remain so for much longer. "Doctor, aren't we coming in a little fast?" Romana asked, one eyebrow raised. "Backseat drivers," the Doctor muttered before continuing more loudly. "As I said, I am sure I remember how to do this." Romana nodded sagely. "Your famous impeccable memory." With the doors now closed, the only view of the outside world came from various monitors on the main console, or scattered around the room housing it. On these it could be seen that the TARDIS had stopped spinning, more or less, and its lateral motion was similarly almost arrested. The same could not be said of its vertical trajectory, however. There was a bone-jarring, crunching thud as the TARDIS hit the ground, and was finally still. Both the Time Lords had bent their knees with the sudden impact, forced into partial crouches. They now straightened up, the Doctor smoothing down his snazzy black suit jacket, while Romana placed her left index finger against the side of her temple. "Flying with your usual due care and attention for the passengers," she observed. The Doctor finished brushing himself down and flashed her a grin. "Anyone you can walk away from," he said cheerily. Romana raised both eyebrows. "A high bar indeed," she exclaimed in a mockingly impressed tone. The Doctor appeared to miss any lack of sincerity entirely, as his tone was just as cheerful when next he spoke. "So, shall we see where we have set down?" Romana inclined her head, then operated the door controls once more. The TARDIS sat upon a wide pavement, which itself marked the edge of a 2-lane highway running in front of a vast palatial building. Such had been the impact of the vehicle's landing that the paving slabs upon which it lay were all cracked and shattered, in stark contrast to those further from the time machine. However, it was not the wanton destruction caused by the Doctor's careless driving which now pressed Romana's brow to furrow and her face to scrunch in disgust. "Doctor, this is Earth!" came her angry accusation, accompanied by a hard stare. "No, it is not," the Doctor responded simply. Romana threw up her hands in her characteristic expression of exasperation. "There's no point denying it. In spite of your stated goal to move us as far from Earth as possible in space and time, you couldn't have got wider of the mark if you tried." "That is the British Museum," she continued impatiently, waving to the building before them. To the left and right of them, wings flanked a courtyard, which was bounded on the side furthest from them by the main body of this Regency-style palatial edifice. At this time it seemed the few remaining visitors were leaving the main building and were strolling towards an exit not far from the Time Lords, as might be expected from the British Museum in early evening. Romana now span and pointed to a nearby red cylinder mounted on the pavement, much like the TARDIS, only with greater care. "That is a post box," Romana continued indignantly. "If that GR on the front is current, I would guess we're in the 1920s or 30s, under one of the Georges. Certainly the vehicles on the street look in keeping with that period." At this, Romana paused and glanced skyward, as do the airships. There were indeed several airships visible at different distances and altitudes moving sedately across the sky. The doctor shook his head with a laboured show of weary patience. "Oh, Romana, Romana, once again have you so little faith? That is not the British Museum. GR is not George Rex, and those are not airships." The doctor then just stood smiling sweetly at Romana. She, in turn, was neither impressed nor convinced. "I think you owe me an explanation," she said slowly before adding, "and it had better be a very, very good one." The doctor inclined his head graciously. "As you wish. This is Albia, not Earth. This is its capital city, Londra. A similar name, I'll grant you, but 1,000,000 billion miles from London Earth." As he said this, the doctor gestured around them airily, encompassing all the various familiar, unfamiliar sights. "That is the Albion Imperial Museum. The GR you see on the postbox over there stands for Gloriana Reg Aina. Gloriana is the Queen Empress of the Albion Empire, and has been for almost 100 glorious years." Now the doctor's arm swept up to capture the sky. "And those are not airships. Well, not all of them anyway. Many of them are spaceships of the Imperial Space Service and other lines." Romana continued to stare coldly at the doctor. "This culture is clearly steeped in earthly traditions and aesthetics. You have obviously dragged us to another outpost of the Terran Empire, or one of its colony worlds. Clearly, and I don't know why I'm surprised, you have been unfaithful to your word and brought us to yet another human-populated world. I am very disappointed in you." The doctor spread his hands wide in a placating manner. "No, no, quite untrue and unfair. No human has ever set foot on this planet, or indeed any in this system. Out-of-system alien visitors are not unheard of, but never from Earth, the Terran Empire, or any human source. We are simply too far off the regular avenues of earthly expansion, commerce, and exploration. Those you see here are Albion, or perhaps more correctly, Chiroan, and once you see them up close, you will see they are quite distinct in appearance from humans, like many other bipedal denizens of the universe." Romana's icy stare had in no way begun to thaw. "Then why does everything look so earthly?" At this, the doctor held up a hand, almost as if to forestall an imminent torrent of ire and recrimination. "Ah, well, you see, there was, once upon a time, one earthly impact on one world in this system. It may have left a tiny mark." "A tiny mark?" Romana repeated skeptically. "Just the smallest of scratches, nothing more," the doctor responded, sounding less convinced of his own words than he might have hoped. 2 or 3 millennia ago, an Earth probe soft-landed on Cairo, one of the innermost of the many habitable planets in this system. It had been launched well over 100,000 years earlier, in the decades leading up to the launch of the Starship UK. The probe had been designed by those most industrious of people as a dual-purpose reconnaissance scout and first contact vehicle. Naturally, by the time it landed here, its first purpose was utterly redundant, rendered useless by distance both in space and time. However, it did rather a good job in the second regard. The probe contained a somewhat idiosyncratic means of familiarizing alien life with the people and history of Earth. It contained a condensed but still multiple-volume edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, in paper book form no less. Romana looked aghast at this, incredulity personified. Paper books. They'd been nothing but dust after millennia of space travel, no matter how well protected from cosmic rays and the like. The doctor held up a finger. "Ah, yes, but they weren't exactly paper. The UK Earthlings had printed their knowledge in primitive book form precisely because it would be easier to interpret and decipher by less technologically advanced civilizations if they were to find it. But they weren't averse to high-tech where needed. The paper was in fact a far more robust polymer weave. engineered for extreme durability. They survived even to this day, recently more or less rediscovered by the Albion Empire. As it was, those first original Chiron discoverers of the probe did decipher the texts and contextualize the imagery. More than that, as the most ancient first wave of Chiron space explorers spread out from their home world in little more than barrels with sails, they took with them slavishly reproduced copies of the original texts, rendered in more primitive materials naturally. These texts molded the thinking of those early interplanetary settlers, and still do to this day. Romana had raised another skeptical eyebrow at the mention of ancient Chiron space explorers traversing the cosmos in barrels, but for now let it slide. She had bigger fish to fry. She froze the doctor in place with the hardest of stares. I would like to say I can't believe you have done this, but this level of dishonesty is par for the course for you. And yet still my own hopes betrayed me. I had hoped this behavior from you had finally run its course. The doctor looked both flustered and shifty. What do you mean? I have taken us ages from Earth, both in time and space. There will be no humans here, and here the doctor's torrent of words were dammed by Romana's raised hand. You may have told the literal truth, but in spirit it is nothing but lies and selfishness, rotten to the core. You knew I wanted new experiences away from Earth, knew this because I told you, and yet what did you want? Clearly you could not shake free from this obsession with all things earthly, at least not entirely. And so you devised this clever ruse in order to keep to the letter of your word, yet all the while satisfying your own wants and desires. With no discussion, no hints, no warning, just an, oh look, what a strange coincidence, how familiar it all seems, and a shrug, and no actual thought or consideration given to anyone else whatsoever. Romana paused momentarily, and unusually the doctor did not fill the silence. His head had even dropped a little. Romana noticed this, but her manner did not soften. I have put up with a lot of this over the years, both when we travelled together the first time and not a little in our most recent adventures. Did you ever stop to think why I left the first time? But I had seen signs of you growing and learning from your recent experiences, had hoped you had begun to break your selfish habits. And yet, here we are. The doctor looked up into Romana's eyes, unable to speak, some internal conflict paralyzing his tongue. Actions have consequences, Romana continued slowly. You of all people should understand that. What you have done today will have repercussions. For good or evil it is hard to say, but things feel far from good right now. The doctor's eyes actually looked quite pained and tortured by this point. His voice was unusually quiet, meek and sincere when next he spoke. Romana, I am sorry. Romana tilted her head slightly and continued to stare him dead in the eye. We shall see, she said simply. The doctor nodded once, grimly. He motioned with his hand towards the TARDIS doors. Let's go, he offered. Romana inclined her head once in response, her expression anything but warm. She entered the TARDIS. The doctor paused for a moment, then followed. Once at the main console, the doctor turned his head and looked quizzically at Romana. Where would you like to go? He asked, almost softly. Romana shook her head. No, you choose, Romana said, smiling coolly. Upon hearing this, the doctor broke into a broad, toothy grin. Think of it as a test, Romana added, with a smile still icy. The doctor's grin froze ridiculously as his eyes took on a desperate searching appearance. Well, yes, this should be safe enough. I mean, excitingly different and to everyone's satisfaction, of course, he finished hurriedly. He then set the controls and threw the launch lever. The TARDIS lurched in several directions at once, screaming and grinding in raucous indignation. By now, given past experiences, one might have expected the Time Lords to have been prepared for such eventualities, and to have held on tightly as a matter of course. And yet the Doctor and Romana both seemed to share an unshakable faith in the TARDIS's ability to launch smoothly and successfully. Much like faith in the honesty of the Doctor's words and motivations, it was utterly unfounded. So it was that the two Time Lords found themselves on their backsides, sliding around the floor. K9 was in an even worse predicament, as he ricocheted off various supports and the central console, wailing, "Master!" or "Mistress!" as he went. As for the TARDIS, in the wider sense it remained motionless. The disturbance passed, the doctor picked himself up and dusted himself down. Now that's damned peculiar, he grumbled to himself, frowning. Romana too stood up, then bent down to put K9 back on his wheels. Peculiar, she agreed cautiously, yet like so much today, oddly and worryingly familiar. Yes, the doctor nodded his slow agreement. He then whirled and pointed fiercely at the robot dog. K9, he gasped. Yes, Master, K9 responded. You are still fully integrated with the FDSS, the four-dimensional stress set, yes? Affirmative, Master. Good boy, the doctor cooed approvingly. Now, he continued briskly, scan the area and look for any signs of space-time instability, anything resembling the damage caused when the universe fragmented and almost dissolved into the bulk. K9 whirred for a second, thinking. Master, I am unclear on the parameters for this search. How far from our current location should I extend the scans? The doctor shook his head, smiling patiently. Now, K9, use your imagination and initiative. I know you have those in your programming somewhere, he said with a wink. Very well, K9 responded. I shall try, Master. With that, the mechanical marvel began to whir and chatter frantically, his antennae spinning furiously. It was fortunate there were no epileptics on board the TARDIS that day, such was the ferocity and intricacy of the patterns in K9's flashing lights. In addition, this was a longer-than-expected audio and visual bombardment. Romana looked towards the doctor with concern, to which he simply shrugged helplessly and cluelessly. All scans completed, Master Mistress, K9 finally piped up. The doctor let out a sigh of relief, echoed unintentionally by Romana, who then looked peeved. The doctor failed to notice her further irritation, as his attention was entirely captured by K9. K9, upload your findings to the TARDIS databanks quickly. A moment's more flashing and whirring. Upload completed, Master. Shall I display the results on the main console? Of course, K9, immediately. With that, the doctor and Romana moved round to one of the monitors on the main console to study K9's findings. The doctor arrived a little ahead of Romana. As she caught up, the doctor's face dropped and became ashen. He looked up in horror into her eyes. Romana, we're trapped. Romana frowned at him, unbelieving. Trapped? She repeated back. The doctor nodded dumbly and waved a listless hand towards the display. Contrary to their expectations, the display did not show a pockmarked vision of the Albion Imperial Museum and its surrounds, complete with the TARDIS on the street outside. It did not even show a similar extended view of the city of Londra itself, complete with space-time damage. The view was not even of the planet Albia, at least not exclusively. The entire star system lay before them as a space-time map. At its center, a bluish B-type star bathed dozens of planets in its balmy glow. Spreading across this map of the system, like some cosmic spider web, were many connected glowing lines, almost as scars or gashes or fractures in the surface. Many of these lines crossed or joined, further increasing the impression of a luminous net. It looks like the damage caused by the universe's fragmentation, but that was supposed to be healing. Why does it look so pronounced here? It's almost as if the universe was not mending at all in this location, Romana mused. The doctor continued to frown, but waggled his head a little as if heartened by something. Well, at least something good has come out of this, he proclaimed. Romana's eyes widened. Really? And how did you work that one out? The doctor waved his hands over the display. From this at least we know our rough landing was not my fault. Romana shook her head slowly. The doctor doth protest too much, methinks. At best we can only say it was not entirely your fault. The doctor harumphed and looked thrown once more. Yes, well, whatever the truth in that, we are nevertheless trapped in this system, on this planet, on this pavement. Romana stared levelly at the doctor. Consequences, she said darkly, and so it begins. The doctor and Romana stared at each other in silence for several long moments. So we're stuck, Romana continued. So much for your great getaway. I can't see us getting much adventure nailed to one spot. The doctor shook his head vigorously. Oh no, you're quite wrong there. I have spent almost entire regenerations in one place before, more or less, and had a great deal to do and experience on those occasions. Romana narrowed her eyes at the doctor. Would that have been on Earth by any chance? The doctor once again looked flustered. Well, not every time, he insisted. Then, seeking to shift attention elsewhere, he looked down at the display and thrust a finger on one point of interest. Look at this, he said urgently. The space-time fractures seem to be radiating out from this inner planet, not from the star itself. That is Upsilon Orionis, by the way, a B-type star, hence the extended habitable zone. If I'm not mistaken, that hot little inner planet is Cairo, the very place of origin of the Albion people. Romana rolled her eyes in exasperation. And much good this information does us, what with the TARDIS grounded and all. The doctor held up a finger. Not at all. The TARDIS may be unable to travel under its own power at this time, but we can. What's more, this is a relatively advanced spacefaring civilization. If we need to travel off-world, as I suspect we might, we can arrange to have the TARDIS shipped with us. Romana nodded her head very slightly in the smallest possible concession to his point. So, again, why so much space-time damage? Why did we not come across it when we were on cleanup duty earlier? The doctor shook his head. Romana, you know full well we did not clean up the whole of space and time, merely those disasters we ourselves encountered. This region of space-time wasn't even in our fragment when the universe shattered, and so we have never seen it until now. Unfortunately, I fear we may run into this sort of thing more often than we might like. Romana stroked her chin thoughtfully, then nodded. I've no doubt you are right. So where now? Given the evidence so far seems to be pointing us to Cairo, yet we are stuck here on Albia. What would you suggest we do? The doctor gave a sly grin. It is true we are hundreds of astronomical units from Cairo, but it just so happens I can think of one place nearer at hand which might be a veritable treasure trove of Cairoan history and lore. Romana stretched her hands wide, inviting the doctor to continue. The doctor was still grinning. Might I suggest a night at the museum?
Masters, mistresses, the Doctor requires materials in order to maintain the TARDIS and ensure continued functionality. He similarly requires carbon-based comestibles to sustain his own biological functions and existence. Master would never say this, but he requires aid beyond that supplied by this unit in order to acquire these. To aid the Doctor in his various tasks and creations, this can be most effectively achieved via Patreon or Substack subscriptions, or through donations directly to PayPal. Or if you desire physical goods in return for your contributions, written accounts of my travels with the Doctor are also available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. Thank you, masters, mistresses.